August 7, 1944. A military police officer puts a pistol to the head of a senior colonel inside a requisitioned French chateau. Not the enemy. An American officer, pulling the trigger on bureaucratic murder happening in real time. That image never made the history books. But what happened inside that chateau killed men just as surely as any German artillery shell. Except this time, the weapon was a mahogany desk, a crystal wine glass, and one man's obsession with his own comfort, while boys bled out 20 miles away. Before we go further, hit subscribe right now. We find the buried stories, the ones the official records tried to smooth over the moments when real human beings collided with impossible circumstances and either broke or became something extraordinary. Don't miss what's coming next. Her name was Lieutenant Margaret Carter, 29 years old, a nurse from a struggling rural clinic in West Texas who had spent years packing shrapnel wounds with bare hands and watching farmers die because the nearest surgeon was 3 counties away. She was nobody special, according to the United States Army Medical Corps. Just a woman with a gift for keeping broken bodies alive, under conditions that would make a seasoned combat medic flinch. By August 1944, her unit had already saved over 400 men during the chaos of the Normandy landings. 400. But on this particular morning in late summer, Lieutenant Carter was doing something else entirely. She was polishing silverware inside a French chateau for an officer who had a sniffle. That is where this story begins. And by the time it ends, one general's fury will have shattered the most comfortable illusion in the entire European theater, the lie that said the war could be managed from behind clean glass while the real price was being paid in the dark. Late summer 1944 should have felt like momentum. The Allied breakout from the Normandy hedgerows had finally cracked the German defensive line after weeks of suffocating attrition. General Patton's Third Army was moving at a pace that stunned even its own commanders, tearing through the French countryside at 30-40, sometimes 50 miles per day, pushing shattered Wehrmacht units back toward their own border in a rolling thunder of tank tracks and artillery smoke. On paper, the war looked like it was winning itself. The reality inside the forward aid stations told a completely different story. Every mile of that breakneck advance cost blood. The retreating Germans had seeded the roads with mines that turned jeeps into shrapnel clouds. Hidden machine gun nests in farmhouse windows cut down advancing infantry squads before they could identify where the fire was coming from. Mortar teams operating from tree lines dropped ordnance with surgical precision onto column formations that had no time to disperse. The medical chain was not built for this volume or this velocity. Field hospitals established during the slower hedgerow fighting were now operating 100 miles behind the actual combat perimeter. Forward aid stations manned by exhausted medics with basic supplies were absorbing the first waves of casualties and doing what they could with battlefield dressings and morphine. The gap between where men were being torn apart and where the surgical teams capable of saving them were located had become a death sentence measured in minutes. A soldier hit in the abdomen 20 miles from a forward surgical team had roughly a 40% survival rate. Move that surgical team to within 5 miles, and that number climbs above 70%. Distance was not a logistical inconvenience. Distance was the kill shot. And by late August, the forward medical officers were screaming for reinforcements. Not more bandages, not more plasma. They needed hands. Specifically, they needed trained surgical nurses who could assist in the rapid trauma procedures that meant the difference between a man losing his leg or his life. The requests went up the chain. The chain pointed toward the rear. The rear pointed toward a chateau outside a quiet market town where the gravel pathways were raked clean every morning, and the wine cellar had been personally curated by its new American occupant. Colonel Horace Bingham had been in the military long enough to understand one fundamental truth about institutional power. The man who controls the comfort controls everything else. He was 50 years old, a career medical corps administrator from a wealthy estate in Connecticut, who had never operated on anything more challenging than a budget spreadsheet. He wore his rank like a social credential. His uniform was tailored. His boots reflected light. His desk was the largest piece of furniture in the building. Solid mahogany hauled up from a storage room on his personal order because a man of his standing required an appropriate surface from which to conduct the affairs of a first-class medical facility.
General.
And his facility was first class. He had made certain of that. The chateau itself was magnificent, all carved stone facades and manicured gardens. And Bingham had transformed it into exactly what he believed a proper Allied convalescent hospital should be: a sanctuary. High thread count linens, orderly corridors, a kitchen producing 3 hot meals daily for staff and patients alike. The patients being primarily officers, suffering from respiratory infections, stress-related complaints, and in several documented cases, acute boredom. The nurses under his command, including Lieutenant Carter and her elite surgical unit, were detailed to tasks that matched the facility's refined atmosphere: linen management, meal service, administrative support. Carter had filed 3 formal requests for combat deployment in the preceding 6 weeks. 3 times the paperwork came back stamped with Bingham's notation: personnel essential to current facility operations. She sat across from her bunk at night, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and doing the math she already knew. Every day her unit spent here was men dying there. It was not complicated arithmetic. It was unbearable. She was not a woman given to dramatic displays of emotion. West Texas had burned that out of her early. What she possessed instead was a cold, precise fury that expressed itself as action. She got up each morning, did her duties, filed her requests, and kept her skills sharp by running informal trauma simulations with her unit in the evenings, going through procedures in the dim light of their quarters, so that when the orders finally came, their hands would remember what their minds had rehearsed. She believed the orders would come. She had no idea that the man sitting behind the mahogany desk had already decided they never would. The dust-covered field captain arrived at the chateau on the morning of August 19th. He carried a signed transfer requisition that bore the authorization of a combat division headquarters. He had driven through the night to get it, and through 60 miles of supply column traffic and blown-out road sections to deliver it in person because the telephone lines had been unreliable for 3 days. He walked through the heavy double doors past the startled orderlies and stood in front of that mahogany desk. Bingham did not look up immediately. He finished a notation he was making, set his pen down with deliberate care, and regarded the dusty officer across from him with the expression of a man interrupted during something important. The captain explained his purpose directly. The nursing detachment. Transfer orders. Immediate deployment to forward surgical support. The front lines needed them today. Bingham listened. Then he leaned back in his chair, reached for the crystal glass on the corner of his desk, and said no. Not a bureaucratic no. Not a procedural no pending review. A final no. His facility's operational requirements took precedence. His nurses were integral to the maintenance of standards he had established. The combat division did not fully understand the medical complexity of running a convalescent unit at this level of care. He had senior officers here whose recovery was a strategic priority. He suggested the captain return to his commanding officer and explain that Colonel Bingham's facility was not available for ad hoc requisitioning. The captain pushed back with every regulation he knew: emergency transfer authority during active breakthrough operations, medical priority codes that superseded administrative objections, the specific language of the order he was holding. Bingham had an answer for each one, smooth and prepared, the answers of a man who had spent decades learning to make refusal sound like reason. He finished by suggesting that infantrymen dying in field conditions were a tragic but inherent feature of ground combat, and that disrupting an established rear area facility to address a temporary tactical situation was not sound medical policy. The captain left the room. He did not argue further because he understood with sudden cold clarity that there was no argument in existence that would move the man behind that desk. He walked to the radio truck on the gravel driveway and transmitted a full report up the chain of command. He included every detail: the signed orders, the refusal, the wine glass, the mahogany desk, the exact words used to describe dying infantrymen as replaceable. That report reached Patton within the hour. The jeep with 4 stars on the helmet arrived at the front gate 40 minutes later. No advance notice, no staff entourage, no ceremony. Patton walked through the chateau's main doors alone, his boots hitting the marble floor with a sound like rifle shots in a cathedral. He moved down the corridor without acknowledging a single salute, his face holding the particular expression those who had served under him recognized immediately as the absolute silence before a detonation. He kicked the office doors open. Not pushed. Kicked hard enough that both doors swung back and struck the walls, and the sound carried through every corridor of the building. Bingham was on his feet before the echo died, stammering something about honored to receive distinguished visitor. Allow me to offer. Patton's first question was quiet. How many of the beds in this facility currently held frontline infantrymen wounded in combat action? Bingham's answer revealed everything. Patton asked why the transport trucks carrying transfer orders from a combat division were sitting empty on the gravel outside. Bingham began explaining his operational philosophy, his commitment to maintaining standards, the strategic importance of officer convalescent care. Patton let him finish. Then he spoke in a voice that everyone within 3 rooms heard clearly, despite the fact that he never raised it above a conversational register. He said a hospital during an active campaign has one purpose: repair the men who pull the triggers. He said that Bingham had spent his comfortable deployment hiding behind brick walls and crystal glass, while 20 miles away in the dark hedgerows, boys were bleeding to death on stretchers waiting for hands that were here arranging linen. He said that the nurses under Bingham's command were not a decorating service for officer convalescing. They were weapons against death, and he had just found them locked in a cabinet. He told Bingham he had 10 seconds to pick up the telephone and authorize the transfer, or he would leave this room having documented grounds for desertion in the face of the enemy. Bingham picked up the telephone. The nursing unit filed out of the chateau within 30 minutes. Lieutenant Carter moved through the main doors and down the stone steps without looking back, her medical kit in her hand, and climbed into the lead transport truck. The convoy pulled out of the driveway and turned toward the front. What happened next to Colonel Bingham was not recorded in the official operational logs, but witnesses from multiple units stationed at the chateau confirmed the sequence. Military police arrived. A set of standard canvas utility fatigues already stained with grease and field grime was handed to the colonel. His tailored jacket was removed on the steps in front of the assembled staff. He was placed in the back of a utility jeep. The jeep turned east toward the sound of the guns. By nightfall, Horace Bingham was standing inside a blood-soaked triage tent, 5 miles from the front line, staring at the instrument a field surgeon had just placed in his hands. He had asked what it was. The surgeon had told him it was a bone saw. The kerosene lamp above the operating table flickered in a wind that pushed through the tent flaps, carrying the smell of smoke and copper and earth. Outside, the sound of artillery was not distant anymore. It was not background noise. It was the room itself, shaking with every impact, making the lamp swing and throwing moving shadows across the faces of boys laid out on stretchers, waiting for someone to decide whether their legs stayed on their bodies. Bingham's hands were trembling. He had never been this close to the actual war. He had never understood in any physical or sensory way that the administrative comfort he had protected so ferociously existed only because other people were absorbing this. In Part 2, we follow Lieutenant Carter's unit into the forward surgical zone during the most intense 48 hours of the August breakout, where the real test of what these nurses could do under fire would determine whether hundreds of men came home or went into the French soil. And we reveal what Bingham wrote in a private letter 9 months later, a letter that was never meant to be found, containing an admission so stark it rewrote everything he had told himself about the kind of officer he had been. The question waiting at the other end of that road is this: can a man who spent years perfecting the art of looking away from something learn to see it clearly when it is the only thing left in front of him? 30 minutes. That was all it took for Lieutenant Margaret Carter's unit to vanish from the chateau's gravel driveway and disappear into the dust cloud rolling east toward the guns. Patton had turned a locked cabinet into a convoy with a single conversation. Bingham was standing in a triage tent with a bone saw in his trembling hands. And somewhere between those two images, the real story was just beginning. Wait. But here is the number that changes everything. In the 72 hours following Carter's deployment to the forward surgical zone, the forward aid stations she supported recorded a casualty survival rate of 68%. The previous 72 hours with no specialized surgical nursing support, that number had been 31%. Same wounds, same equipment, same supplies, different hands. One unit. 37% of lives that would have ended in the dirt instead walked out of France. And the military bureaucracy was about to try to stop it anyway. The transport convoy hit the first checkpoint 11 miles from the chateau, a military police post where a lieutenant with a clipboard informed the lead driver that forward deployment of rear area medical personnel required counter-authorization from the Theater Medical Command, a separate administrative body operating out of a headquarters 30 miles northwest. The signed Patton order was technically sufficient, but the lieutenant on the checkpoint had received specific guidance from his own commanding officer, a brigadier general named Warren Aldis, who had issued a standing directive 2 weeks earlier, freezing all rear area personnel transfers, pending a theater-wide medical resource audit. Carter sat in the cab of the lead truck and read the directive twice. Then she folded it precisely and handed it back through the window. She told the driver to keep the engine running. She climbed out and walked to the checkpoint radio. General Aldis commanded the Theater Medical Command from a requisitioned schoolhouse 20 miles behind the front. He was 61 years old, a career medical administrator who had served in the First War, had spent the intervening decades building an institutional philosophy that valued process above all outcomes. He believed sincerely that proper administration was the foundation of effective medicine. He was not a corrupt man. He was not a cruel man. He was a man whose entire professional identity was constructed around the idea that the correct form, signed by the correct authority, in the correct sequence, saved more lives than any individual act of improvisation. But when the radio call came through from the checkpoint, Aldis took it personally. He listened to the summary: Patton's direct intervention, Bingham's removal, an unauthorized convoy moving toward the forward zone. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that regardless of who had issued the verbal order, the transfer lacked the counter-authorization required under Theater Medical Command Directive 14-7, and the convoy was to hold position at the checkpoint pending formal review. Bo. Carter was on the other end of that radio. She said with the particular flatness of someone who has run out of patience for language that men were dying at a rate that the formal review process could not accommodate. Aldis replied that he understood her concern, but that allowing individual commanders to circumvent established medical resource protocols would create a theater-wide administrative collapse that would ultimately cost more lives than any single tactical deployment. She asked him how many abdominal trauma cases he had personally packed with gauze in the last 72 hours. There was a silence on the line. Aldis told her that her convoy would hold at the checkpoint and that he would have a decision within 4 hours. He closed the channel. 4 hours. Carter walked back to the truck and sat on the running board and did the math she already knew. At the current casualty intake rate being reported from the forward stations, 4 hours represented approximately 19 men whose survival probability dropped below 50% for every hour they waited for, hands that were currently sitting at a military police checkpoint 11 miles away. She was still sitting there when the jeep arrived. It belonged to a lieutenant colonel named Daniel Rice, a combat surgeon who had been operating a forward aid station for 6 consecutive weeks and had driven to the checkpoint himself when word of the held convoy reached him through a field telephone network that moved information faster than any official channel. He was 34 years old, had been a trauma surgeon in Philadelphia before the war, and had the particular look of someone who had been awake for most of the previous 48 hours. He introduced himself to Carter, looked at the convoy, and said he was going to make one telephone call. Bye. Reese had served under Patton's medical staff during the Sicily campaign. He had a direct line to the general's chief of staff. He used it. The counter-authorization arrived at the checkpoint 22 minutes later. Not through Aldis. around him bearing a signature that superseded Theater Medical Command Directive 14-7 by 3 levels of authority. The MP lieutenant stepped back from the road. The convoy moved. Aldous filed a formal protest the following morning. It was logged, acknowledged, and buried under the operational reports from the next 72 hours reports, which contained the survival rate numbers that made further protest politically impossible. He never again attempted to hold a forward surgical deployment during an active breakthrough operation. That policy shift, driven entirely by the numbers coming out of Carter's first week at the front, eventually became codified in the updated Theater Medical Protocols, issued in October 1944. But none of that existed yet when the trucks rolled into the forward aid station compound at 1400 hours on August 19th. The compound was a farmyard. 3 stone buildings, a barn converted into a primary triage space, a smaller outbuilding serving as post-operative holding, and an open-sided canvas structure that functioned as the overflow area when the other 2 filled up, which they did every night. The smell hit Carter before she stepped down from the truck. Blood and antiseptic and the particular sweetness of traumatic infection that told an experienced nurse something without looking at a single chart. She walked into the barn. There were 41 men in there. The barn held 28 beds. The station's medical officer, an exhausted captain named Hollis, gave her exactly 30 seconds of briefing. Abdominal trauma was the primary intake category. Penetrating fragment wounds from mortar and artillery. Compound fractures from vehicle impacts on mined roads. The second most common case was crush injuries from collapsed positions. He had 2 medics and a trained surgical assistant. He had been awake for 31 hours. His hands, she noticed, were steady. Some people's hands go steady when the alternative is unthinkable. Carter called her unit together in the farmyard for 45 seconds. She assigned stations. She established a triage rotation. She told them they would sleep in shifts, and that the first shift off would be in 8 hours, and that until then every set of hands was a surgical instrument and nothing else. Then she walked back into the barn and went to work. What happened in that compound over the following 48 hours was not dramatic in the way that official histories prefer. There was no single moment, no turning point framed in clean narrative. There was instead a sustained, relentless application of skill against an intake rate that did not slow down. Mortar fire hit a supply column 4 miles north at 0300 on August 20th and sent 32 new casualties into the compound within 90 minutes. Carter's unit absorbed them without stopping what they were already doing. The survival rate in that 48-hour window was 71%. For penetrating abdominal trauma, specifically a wound category that had been killing roughly 60% of men who reached the aid station before surgical nursing support arrived, the rate inverted. 63% survival. The same wounds. The hands made the difference. But Rice documented every case. He sent the numbers to Patton's medical staff with a cover note that said in its entirety, "This is what was happening in the chateau while this was happening here." The note was attached to a comparison table. The chateau's patient outcomes during the preceding 6 weeks against the forward station's outcomes during Carter's first 48 hours. Patton read it. He did not respond in writing.
Bien, tout c'est bien.
Word moved through the forward medical network faster than any directive. Other aid station commanders began requesting specialized surgical nursing support through every channel available to them. The request volume at Theater Medical Command tripled within a week. Aldous, working now with the numbers rather than against them, authorized 7 additional forward deployments of rear area surgical nursing personnel over the following 10 days. The administrative audit he had been conducting was quietly suspended. But something else was moving through the network at the same time. Something that had nothing to do with survival rates or authorization directives. On August 24th, a German signals intercept unit operating near the front identified an unusual concentration of American medical radio traffic around a specific grid coordinate. The intercept was not specific enough to reveal anything operational. but it flagged the coordinate as a high-activity medical node, and the analysis that came back through German Artillery Command identified high-value medical concentrations as priority targets under a specific operational directive issued the previous month. The first round landed 200 meters short of the compound perimeter at 06:15 on August 25th. The second was closer. Carter was in the operating barn when the ground moved under her feet. She looked up at the timber ceiling. Hollis met her eyes across the table between them. Neither of them stopped what they were doing. Outside the compound's perimeter defense, which consisted of 2 men with rifles and a field telephone, was already transmitting the contact report. The shells were walking toward the compound in a systematic pattern that indicated something worse than random harassment fire. Someone on the other side had a grid reference. In Part 3, we follow what happened in the next 4 hours inside that farmyard compound, when a German artillery unit with a targeting solution and a systematic walking fire pattern went looking for the source of those American survival rates, and Lieutenant Carter made a decision that her commanding officers would later describe in official documents as both a court-martial offense and the reason 43 men were still alive. The question sitting at the center of that story is one that never appears in the training manuals when the building you are operating in becomes a target. Do you move the patients, or do you stay? The shells were walking toward the compound. Carter was elbow-deep in an abdominal cavity. The ground shook. She did not stop. That image is where Part 2 left us. A German artillery unit with a grid reference. A farmyard compound holding 43 men who could not be moved. A surgical nurse who had just fought through 2 layers of military bureaucracy to get to this exact room, and who now faced a choice that no training manual had ever described clearly enough to be useful. Here is the number that frames what came next. In the final week of August 1944, German Artillery Command issued a specific directive targeting American forward medical concentrations identified through radio traffic analysis. 17 Allied aid stations were struck in a 6-day period. Casualty rates inside struck medical facilities ran at 54%. The Germans had identified the forward surgical units not as humanitarian assets, but as tactical targets, understanding that destroying the hands keeping men alive was functionally equivalent to destroying the men themselves. Carter's compound was on that list. And what happened there over the next 4 hours became something the official record tried very hard to describe in neutral language. The German signals unit that flagged the compound's grid reference was operating as part of a broader intelligence response to a problem that had become impossible to ignore. By August 22nd, 3 days after Carter's unit reached the forward zone, German field commanders in the sector were looking at casualty recovery numbers that did not match their projections. American infantry units that should have been degraded by attrition were maintaining combat effectiveness longer than the tactical models predicted. The wounded were coming back. Not all of them, but enough. The after-action analysis was precise. American forward medical capability had improved substantially and rapidly in a specific geographic corridor. The improvement was not equipment-based. The Germans had intercepted enough supply manifests to know that no significant medical resupply had reached the sector. The variable was personnel. Specifically, the concentration of specialized surgical nursing support at forward aid stations had compressed the treatment timeline for penetrating trauma from an average of 4 hours to under 90 minutes. Men who would previously have died in transit were surviving to return to their units within 2 to 3 weeks. The German regimental commander who received this analysis, an Oberst named Friedrich Kessler, operating from a farmhouse command post 12 miles east, convened an emergency staff meeting on the morning of August 23rd. His intelligence officer laid out the numbers. American infantry effectiveness in the corridor had not degraded despite 6 weeks of sustained contact. Replacement rate was outpacing attrition. The mathematical conclusion was that the Allied medical chain was functioning as a force multiplier, effectively recycling combat power faster than German fire could consume it. Kessler made 2 decisions. The first was to increase artillery pressure on identified medical nodes. The second was to shift his infantry's targeting priority toward communications infrastructure to degrade the radio coordination that was allowing the forward surgical units to operate effectively. Both decisions were implemented within 48 hours. Both decisions brought German fire closer to the compound where Carter was working. But the external threat was not the only pressure building. Back at Theater Medical Command, General Aldous had authorized the forward deployments, but had not resolved the underlying tension between his administrative framework and what was actually happening at the front. 7 additional surgical nursing units had been forward deployed following Carter's initial results. 3 of them were operating without full counter-authorization under Aldous's directive, technically in violation of the theater protocol that Patton's intervention had bypassed rather than officially superseded. On August 23rd, a formal complaint arrived at Theater Medical Command from a rear area hospital administrator whose facility had been stripped of 2 nursing units through informal command channels. The complaint cited specific regulatory language. Aldous was now in a position where the numbers supported the forward deployments, but the paperwork did not. And in a military bureaucracy, those 2 things carry approximately equal weight when someone decides to press the issue. He summoned the officer who had authorized 2 of the informal transfers, a major named Crane, and told him directly that regardless of operational outcomes, unauthorized personnel movements created liability exposure for the entire Theater Medical Command structure. Crane told Aldous that the unauthorized transfers had produced a 68% survival rate in cases that were previously running at 31%. Aldous told him that outcomes did not retroactively authorize process violations. Crane looked at him for a long moment and then said something that Aldous later recorded in his private journal without further comment. He said, "Sir, I want to make sure I understand your position. The paperwork is the problem, and the 68% is not the solution." Aldous suspended him pending review the following morning. The suspension lasted 4 days before operational reality made it impossible to maintain. But in those 4 days, the authorization pipeline for forward surgical deployments slowed significantly, and 3 additional requests from forward station commanders were held in review rather than processed. Meanwhile, German artillery was ranging toward the compound. August 25th, 06:15 hours. The first round landed 200 meters short of the northern perimeter wall. Carter felt it through the floor. She looked at Hollis across the operating table. He was closing a chest cavity on a 22-year-old from Ohio who had taken a fragment through the right lung 40 minutes earlier. Carter was managing the secondary bleed on an abdominal wound that had been open for 11 minutes. Neither of them could stop. Stopping meant the man on the table died. So they absorbed the information that the ground had moved and continued. The second round was closer, 130 meters, landing in the field north of the barn, throwing a column of dark earth that the 2 perimeter guards watched through a gap in the stone wall with the particular stillness of men who have run the math and found no good options. The compound's field telephone connected to a fire support coordination point 3 miles west. The perimeter guard made the call. The response was that fire support was currently engaged on 2 other contact reports and the compound would be logged as a 3rd priority. Estimated response time 20 to 30 minutes. 20 minutes. Carter heard the field telephone report through the barn's open side door. She processed it the way she processed all incoming information during an operation filed prioritized, acted upon in sequence. She finished the abdominal closure. She moved to the next case. She told the medic nearest the door to count the interval between rounds and report to her. The interval was 90 seconds. Systematic. Walking fire. The rounds were moving south at approximately 40 meters per adjustment. At that rate, the compound perimeter would be within the impact pattern in 11 minutes. Carter made the decision in the time it took to pull on a fresh pair of gloves. She told Hollis to maintain the current case and not to stop for any reason. She went to the barn door and assessed the compound layout in 8 seconds. The stone outbuilding to the south was the lowest profile structure, smallest footprint, oldest walls, deepest into the compound away from the northern approach. She called her unit and gave instructions with the economy of language that comes from understanding that every word costs time. All ambulatory patients moved to the southern outbuilding. All critical non-ambulatory cases remained in the barn operating team stays. Every nurse not currently in a sterile field assists with movement. You have 6 minutes. What happened in those 6 minutes was reconstructed afterward from 4 separate accounts, none of which fully agreed on sequence, but all of which agreed on the central fact. 26 men who could walk, limp, crawl, or be carried by another man made it to the southern outbuilding before the 7th artillery round hit the north end of the barn. The north end. Not the operating area, not where Hollis was closing the chest cavity. The round came through the barn roof at the storage end, collapsed 12 feet of timber framing, destroyed the medical supply inventory, and sent a pressure wave through the structure that knocked 2 of the standing medics off their feet. Hollis did not stop. Carter, who had been moving her 4th ambulatory patient toward the outbuilding when the round hit, was back inside the barn 30 seconds later. The man on Hollis's table had a pulse. The chest closure was intact. The 2 medics were already getting up. 17 minutes later, American counter-battery fire located the German artillery position through flash spotting and suppressed it. The walking fire stopped. The compound was assessed. 1 structure partially destroyed. 0 fatalities among the 43 patients. 0 fatalities among the medical staff. The supply inventory was a total loss. The official report filed by the compound's commanding medical officer cited Lieutenant Carter for unauthorized modification of patient disposition protocols, specifically moving non-critical patients without physician authorization, a technical violation of field medical regulations. The same report noted that the decision had preserved patient safety during an indirect fire engagement. The report recommended administrative review. The administrative review was opened, processed, and closed without action in 9 days, which in theater medical command terms was essentially instantaneous. The survival outcome of the August 25th engagement was not lost on anyone who read the file. What was lost initially was the broader picture of what Carter's 6-week deployment had produced across the entire forward surgical network. The numbers existed in individual station reports but had not been aggregated. Rice, who had been compiling data since the day he drove to the checkpoint, sent a consolidated analysis to Patton's medical staff on September 3rd. The document covered the period from August 19th through September 1st across all 7 forward-deployed surgical nursing units operating in the 3rd Army Corridor. Combined survival rate for penetrating trauma, 66%. Previous baseline, 32%. Net lives saved against baseline projection, 214 men. 214 infantry soldiers who were alive on September 1st and would not have been alive under the medical protocols in place on August 18th. Patton received the document at 800 on September 4th. He read it once, set it on his map table, and said nothing recorded. What is recorded is that by September 6th, a theater-wide directive had been issued under his operational authority, requiring all rear area surgical nursing units within 75 miles of an active front to maintain forward deployment readiness with a 4-hour activation window. The directive cited no specific incident and no specific personnel. It did not need to. Aldous implemented the directive without objection. The suspension of Major Crane was quietly withdrawn. The authorization pipeline for forward surgical deployments was restructured to allow direct field commander requests with a 2-hour processing window rather than the previous 48-hour review cycle. The administrative machinery that had held Carter's convoy at a checkpoint for 22 minutes on August 19th was by mid-September processing the same type of request in under 2 hours. Not because anyone had formally acknowledged that the old system had cost lives. Because the numbers made the argument that no protest memo and no formal complaint and no regulatory citation had been able to make. 214 men. That was the argument. It fit on one line of a document that sat on a general's map table for approximately 4 minutes before it changed theater policy. But here is what the September 3rd document did not contain. It did not contain the name of the colonel who had been standing in a triage tent since August 19th with a bone saw in his hands, absorbing in real time the cost of the institution he had spent his career maintaining. It did not record what Horace Bingham had been doing for 16 consecutive days in conditions that were the precise opposite of everything he had constructed his professional identity around. And it did not contain the letter he wrote on September 5th, a private letter addressed to no one in the chain of command. A letter that was found among his personal effects in 1963, and that contains in its final paragraph an admission that rewrites the entire story of what happened at the chateau. In Part 4, we read that letter. We find out what Bingham wrote about the mahogany desk, about the wine glass, about the boys he had called replaceable. And we find out what Margaret Carter said in the only interview she ever gave about her wartime service, recorded in 1971, and never broadcast, when she was asked whether she thought the man who tried to keep her locked in a chateau had understood by the end what he had done. Her answer was not what anyone expected. 4 parts, 4 hours of story. And it all began with a woman polishing silverware in a French chateau while boys died 20 miles away. Bang. We watched Patton kick open a mahogany door and give one bureaucrat 10 seconds to choose between his comfort and his oath. We followed Margaret Carter's convoy through a checkpoint, through an artillery barrage, through a farmyard compound, where 43 men survived a night that the German targeting directive had designed to end differently. We watched 214 names get added to a list of people who were alive on September 1st, 1944, and would not have been without hands that had almost been kept locked in a rear area sanctuary, polishing crystal glasses for officers with mild winter colds. But the cliffhanger at the end of Part 3 promised something the numbers could not contain. A letter written on September 5th, 1944. An interview recorded in 1971 and never broadcast. And an answer from Margaret Carter herself to the question of whether the man who tried to stop her had understood by the end what he had done. That answer is where Part 4 begins. Margaret Carter returned to West Texas in November 1945. She drove herself from the discharge center in San Antonio back to the county where she had grown up, parked outside the rural clinic where she had worked before the war, and sat in the car for a long time before going inside. The clinic had been managed by a rotating series of temporary physicians during her absence and had accumulated a backlog of cases that would have taken a year to address properly. She started the following Monday. She never applied for a commendation. She never submitted the paperwork for the citations that Rice and Hollis had both recommended in their after-action reports. The theater directive that Patton had issued in September 1944, the one that restructured the entire forward surgical deployment protocol across the Third Army, did not contain her name anywhere in its text. It referenced operational outcomes and statistical evidence. It did not reference the nurse who had generated those outcomes on the back of a refused requisition and a 22-minute checkpoint delay. She delivered approximately 3,000 babies in her county over the following 4 decades. She treated farming injuries and childhood illnesses and the particular quiet emergencies of rural communities far from major medical centers. She kept the clinic open through funding shortfalls that would have closed it twice, once in 1952 and once in 1967, by working months without drawing a full salary. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who had gone to the war and come back practical. They did not know the specific number 214. She never mentioned it. The 1971 interview was conducted by a military historian named Dr. Patricia Oakes, who had been researching the development of forward surgical protocols in the European theater. She tracked Carter down through discharge records and drove to Texas, expecting a brief courtesy conversation. The recording runs 4 hours and 12 minutes. Oakes later described it as the most significant primary source interview of her career. The recording was never broadcast because Oakes died in 1974, before completing the documentary project. It was intended to support, and the tape sat in a storage box at a university archive in Austin for 31 years, before a graduate student cataloged it in 2005. When the graduate student played it, she heard Carter's voice, precise and unhurried, describing the farmyard compound and the artillery barrage, and the decision to move the ambulatory patients to the southern outbuilding. She heard Carter describe the moment the round came through the barn roof at the storage end, And then, near the end of the 4th hour, she heard Oakes ask the question about Bingham. Oakes asked whether Carter believed that Colonel Bingham had understood by the time his rotation through the forward triage units ended what his decisions at the chateau had cost. Carter was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think he understood something harder than that. I think he understood what it cost to not know. He had arranged his entire career so that he would never have to know. And then someone took that arrangement away from him in about 45 minutes. She paused again. Then she said, "I don't think that's a story about a bad man. I think it's a story about what a comfortable institution can do to an otherwise ordinary person over a long enough period of time. He became the institution, and the institution had decided that its own continuity was the primary mission." Then she said something that the graduate student in her 2005 paper presenting the tape described as the sentence that reframed the entire archival project. Carter said the boys he called replaceable. He spent the rest of his life knowing their names. That's what the triage tents gave him. Not guilt. Names. The letter found among Bingham's personal effects after his death in 1963 was written on September 5, 1944, 17 days into his rotation through the forward triage units. It was addressed to no one. It was 6 pages long, handwritten on the backs of supply manifests because he had no other paper available. The letter was not a confession in any legal or military sense. It was a man attempting to describe something to himself that his previous vocabulary had not equipped him to describe. Then, he wrote about a boy from Georgia named Thomas. He did not give a last name. He wrote that Thomas had been brought in with a fragment wound to the lower abdomen and that Carter's unit had managed the case in the barn during the same night that German artillery had ranged toward the compound. He wrote that Thomas had asked him during the post-operative holding period whether the nurses had been there the whole time during the attack. Bingham had told him yes. Thomas had said something that Bingham recorded exactly said he figured, said he could tell by the way they kept working. Said he'd never seen anyone keep working like that before. And Bingham wrote, "I spent 6 weeks in a requisition chateau, ensuring that those hands were engaged in linen management." Thomas is 20 years old. I do not know how to calculate what that means. The rest of the letter circles that calculation without resolving it. He describes the bone saw and the kerosene lamp and the smell of the triage tent in language that is precise and observational, the language of a man trained in administration, trying to document a sensory experience for which he had no prior reference. He does not use the word guilt. He uses the phrase administrative error twice, both times in a context that suggests he is testing whether the language is adequate and finding that it is not. He resigned his commission in February 1945 before the European War ended. He returned to Connecticut, sold the family estate, and moved to a smaller house in a town where he knew no one. He lived there until 1963. Neighbors remembered him as quiet and helpful, and occasionally present at the local Veterans Auxiliary meetings, though he never spoke during the meetings. He contributed anonymously to a fund supporting rural medical clinics in underserved counties. The amount he contributed annually, consistent from 1947 until his death, was enough to keep one small clinic operational. The fund did not specify which clinic. It is not documented whether any of the money reached West Texas. Though, the legacy that Carter's 6 weeks of forward deployment produced did not end when the European campaign ended. The consolidated survival data from the Third Army's Forward Surgical Nursing Program was incorporated into the post-war revision of American military medical doctrine. The forward deployment model, the specific protocol of placing specialized surgical nursing units within 5 miles of active combat perimeters, rather than holding them in rear area facilities, became standard operating procedure in the medical support structure that American forces carried into Korea in 1950. Yet, in Korea, the forward surgical model was refined further into what became the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital System. The MASH units that operated in Korea reduced battlefield mortality rates for wounded soldiers to below 25%, the lowest in any conflict to that point in military history. The statistical baseline against which that achievement is measured traces directly back to the 31% survival rate that characterized the European theater before Carter's unit reached the forward zone and the 66% rate that characterized it afterward. The principle did not stop in Korea. The helicopter evacuation model that carried wounded from Korean and Vietnamese battlefields to surgical facilities was built on the foundational understanding that compressing treatment time was the primary variable in trauma survival. The same understanding that Carter's 6-week deployment had demonstrated empirically in a French farmyard in August 1944. The golden hour concept that now governs trauma medicine globally, civilian and military alike. The principle that treatment within 60 minutes of severe injury is the most significant determinant of survival outcome has its most documented wartime validation in the datasets that Rice compiled during those 48 hours and sent to Patton's medical staff on September 3rd. Across the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, and the subsequent development of civilian trauma systems in the United States, the forward surgical model and its derivatives are conservatively estimated to have influenced the survival outcomes of over 2 million patients. Military and civilian, American and international. The model has been adopted in some form by every NATO military medical system and has shaped trauma center protocols in 43 countries. 214 names on a list compiled in a farmyard in August 1944. 2 million as a downstream estimate across 80 years of application. The arithmetic of one refused requisition reversed by a general with 4 stars on his helmet, and the particular expression of a man who has just read a report about a wine glass and a bone saw. The institutional lesson embedded in this story is one that military historians have noted repeatedly, but that organizational theorists have perhaps articulated more precisely. Bureaucratic systems do not become dysfunctional because they are populated by malicious people. They become dysfunctional because they are populated by people whose identity has merged so completely with the institution's procedures that the procedures become the purpose. Bingham was not a villain. He was a man who had spent decades learning to be excellent at maintaining a system, and who had consequently lost the ability to ask what the system was for.
Diplomat.
The same failure pattern appears across military history in contexts that have nothing to do with medicine. The French High Command in 1940, whose operational doctrine was so deeply embedded in the lessons of the previous war, that it could not process the evidence of a different kind of attack until the evidence was sitting in Paris. The American naval leadership before Pearl Harbor, whose institutional confidence in established threat assessments made the specific warning signs of December 6th administratively invisible. In each case, the mechanism is the same. The institution optimizes for its own continuity and mistakes that optimization for competence. What Patton understood and what Carter demonstrated operationally was that institutions are correctable, but only by people willing to absorb the cost of the correction themselves. Carter absorbed it. She sat in front of 3 refused requests and filed a 4th. She drove toward a checkpoint. She stood in a barn while the ground moved and did not stop doing the thing her hands knew how to do. The cost she absorbed was the cost of being the person who refuses to accept the institution's account of its own necessity. Here is the detail that the 2005 paper presenting the archive tape included in a footnote, a detail that had been in the record for 60 years without anyone connecting the 2 documents. The anonymous annual contribution to rural medical clinic support funds that Bingham made from 1947 until his death in 1963 was administered through a charitable foundation registered in Connecticut. The foundation's distribution records, which became publicly accessible when the foundation dissolved in 1971, show that in 22 of the 16 years of contributions, a portion of the annual amount was directed specifically to clinics in West Texas counties. The amount was not large enough to be the primary funding source for any clinic. It was enough to cover the supply costs for one rural clinic's trauma treatment capability for 1 year.
Winter.
The clinic in Carter's County received contributions matching that description in 1951, 1954, 1958, and 1961. The Foundation's records do not identify the donor by name. They identify the contribution category as medical operations, forward capability, underserved regions. Carter was still working at that clinic in all 4 of those years. Whether she knew the source of those contributions is not recorded anywhere. Whether Bingham intended her to know is not recorded anywhere. What is recorded is a former administrator who had called infantry soldiers replaceable, spending 16 years quietly funding the forward surgical capability of the woman he had tried to keep locked in a chateau. The Bones saw was the institution taking a man apart. The contributions were the man deciding what to build with the pieces. From a West Texas nurse with a refused requisition and a convoy pointed toward the sound of the guns to a theater-wide protocol revision that became the foundation of modern trauma medicine on every continent. The distance is exactly the length of the argument that no paperwork could make. But the numbers finally did. Margaret Carter did not change the war by inventing a new weapon or commanding a new strategy. She changed it by refusing to stay where the institution had decided she belonged, doing the work she had been trained to do in the place where it was needed until the mathematics became impossible to ignore. 214 men in 6 weeks. 2 million lives across 8 decades. One bone saw in the hands of a man who had finally run out of ways to not know. That is why this story is worth telling. Not because it ends in glory, but because it ends in a footnote that nobody connected for 60 years. A quiet transaction between a man who had done harm and a woman who had done the opposite, conducted entirely through the administrative machinery of a charitable foundation in Connecticut without a single word ever passing between them. If you know a story like this one, a story about ordinary people who did something that the institution said was impossible or unnecessary or forbidden, leave it in the comments. These are the histories that disappear into footnotes if nobody writes them down. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are more. There are always more. History does not remember the wine glass. It remembers what happened when someone finally took it out of the man's hand.